right, so here we're going to talk about inverse functions. Now, to find an inverse of a function, all you're going to do is swap the x and y values. If you guys remember from geometry, this is really just reflecting your function in the line y equals x. Okay, so let's say we have this function here. I'm calling it f of x. And let's say it goes through the points 1, 0, 2, 1, and then 5, 2. Sorry, this is a little sloppy. It's kind of hard to do it with the stylus here. If we wanted to find the inverse of f of x, what we would do is we would just switch these x and y values. So instead of 1, 0, we would plot the point 0, 1. So 0, 1 would be right here. Okay, then instead of 2, 1, we would plot the point 1, 2. You're just switching the x and y values. And then if we took 5, 2 and switched your x and y values, it would bring us to 2, 5. Okay, so this right here would be the inverse. And what we do is we could label that f, this is the little symbol for inverse, f inverse of x. So again, all we're doing is we're just switching our x and y values. We're reflecting in the line y equals x. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples in the packet. If you take a look at number 1, it says, if a function is defined by the equation y equals 3x plus 2, which equation defines the inverse of this function? All right, well, this time if you're given an equation instead of coordinates, like in that example I just made up, what we're going to do is we're going to switch our x and y within the equation. So instead of y equals 3x plus 2, we're going to have x equals 3y plus 2. So again, all I did was I switched my y to an x, and I switched my x to a y. And then what you want to do is you just want to solve for y in this equation. You want to get y by itself. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides of the equation, leaving me with x minus 2 equals 3y. And then I'm going to divide by 3. So you could divide both sides of the equation by 3. So on the left side, you could either put this whole entire thing, this whole entire binomial over 3, or if you look at the way the answer choices are, they just individually divided everything by 3. So these are going to cancel, leaving me with y equals, and in front of this x there's a 1, so I could write that as 1x over 3, which is just 1/3 x, and then minus 2/3. All right, so it looks like that matches up with letter C. So these two, sorry about that. So these two functions right here, this and this, are inverses of each other. If you graph them on a set of axes, you would see that they're basically just a reflection in the line y equals x, okay? They have the, x and y coordinates kind of flip-flopped. All right, so let's do the same thing with number 2. Now, first of all, with number 2, another way of saying f of x is y equals. So this really says y equals 1/2 x plus 3/2. All right, if you want to try this on your own, you could just hit pause on the video and you could try to do with this one exactly what we did on number 1. If you'd rather follow along for another example, I'm just going to go through it. So first thing we want to do is we want to switch our y to an x and our x to a y. Okay, so I rewrote this equation exactly like we see it, but I changed this y to an x, and I changed our x to a y. And then we're just going to get y by itself in this equation. So I'm first going to add 3/2 to both sides of the equation. So that would leave me with x plus 3/2 equals 1/2 y. And you could do one of two things. I mean, technically you could divide by the number in front of the y. You could divide everything by 1/2. Or I like to just, rather than have a fraction divided by another fraction, I'm going to just multiply by the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2 over 1. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2 over 1. Or you could just write that as 2 if you want. That's totally fine. Okay, and the reason I do that is because then this 2 cancels off with this 2, and basically you're left with 1 divided by 1, which is just 1, so you're left with 1y. And on this side, when you distribute, 2 over 1 times x is just 2x. And then plus 2 over 1 times 3 over 2. When you multiply those, this 2 on top would cancel with this 2 on the bottom, leaving you with just 3 on top and 1 on the bottom. So 3 over 1, which is just 3. All right, so we have y being equal to 2x plus 3. Now, because they originally called this f of x instead of y, I'm going to take this y and change it back, not just to f of x, but to f inverse of x, because this equation is representing our inverse function. And I'll bring down my 2x plus 3. So it looks like that is letter A. All right, so if at any point you want to try some of these on your own, just to see how you do, you could just hit pause, try them out, and then, hit play and see how you did. All right, in number 3, I mean, technically you could, if you wanted to, you could get y by itself in this equation before you switch the x and y, but by doing that, you're just creating more work for yourself. It's a lot faster to just jump right into changing your x to a y, so we'll make that 2y instead of 2x, and changing your y to an x, so we'll make that 3x instead of 3y. And now all we have to do is just get the y by itself. So I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. So that'll leave me with 2y equals negative 3x plus 6. And then to get y by itself, let's just divide everything by 2. And if you don't want to individually write like divided by 2, you could just put this whole side over 2, as long as you remember to individually divide both terms by 2. All right, so these 2's cancel, so I can bring down, instead of the y equals, I'm going to bring down f inverse of x equals. And then it looks like here we're going to have, this doesn't simplify, so I'm going to leave that as negative 3/2 x. And then plus, well, 6 divided by 2 does simplify. 6 divided by 2 is 3, so I'm going to make that a 3. So that matches up with this one right here, letter B. Okay, so number 4 gives us a function, they call it f of x. So I'm going to just, another way of saying f of x is y equals, so I'm just going to put a y equals on top of that. And what they want us to do is they want us to find f inverse of x. So let's do the same thing we've done for the rest. Let's change this y to an x. And let's change this x to a y. All right, so to get the y by itself, let's first subtract 1 from both sides of the equation. So that leaves us with x minus 1 equals y minus 3 in parentheses squared. Now, since the y is in a parenthesis and there's a square on the outside, we have to get rid of that square. So in order to get rid of a square, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So let's take the square root of the left side and the square root of the right side. So let's start with the right side. On the right side, the reason we did that is because a square and a square root cancel each other out. So I'm just going to take the y minus 3 and just bring it right down. And on the left side, don't forget when we take the square root, right, this squared right here, we have a y squared, it's telling us we're going to have 2 solutions to this equation. So when we take the square root of both sides, we need to remember to include our plus and minus in front of the, that doesn't even look like a plus and minus. Let me kind of erase that and write that again. So we want to write our plus and minus in front of the radical x minus 1. I mean, radical x minus 1 doesn't simplify, so we're going to leave that as is. And then to get the y by itself, let's just add 3 to both sides of the equation. So instead of y, I'm going to write f inverse of x. And then here, usually we arrange this. We put our whole number first, and then we put plus and minus this radical. So we'll have 3 plus and minus radical x minus 1. Now, I mean, if you like to rewrite this so you have your f inverse of x first, and then your 3 plus and minus radical x minus 1, that's fine as well. All right, number 5 is definitely a little bit trickier. So, you might want to pause the video and try it on your own and see what you can do. All right, so another way of saying f of x is y equals, just like we've seen in a lot of the other examples. So to start this, I'm going to switch my y to an x, and I'm going to switch both of my x's to y's. All right, so now, if the right-hand side of the equation is a fraction, I like to make this into a fraction by putting it over 1, because then it allows me to cross multiply. So, when you cross multiply, you can multiply the top left by the bottom right. So if we do x times y minus 2, you're basically distributing this x to both terms. So this is going to be x, y, and then minus 2x. So I'm going to write xy minus 2x. Okay, then I'm going to bring down my equal sign. Now you're going to multiply the top right by the bottom left. So y plus 5 times 1 is just y plus 5. Now, some of you may be looking at this and saying, well, how am I supposed to solve for y? Because we have 1 over here attached to an x, and then we have another 1 over here. All right, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get every term that contains a y on one side of the equation and all the other terms on the other side of the equation. So if I subtract y from both sides of the equation, I'm bringing my y terms to the left, and then if I add 2x to both sides of the equation, I'm moving anything without a y to the right. So what's going to happen is negative 2x and positive 2x cancel, and I'm going to bring down the xy minus y. I can't combine those because those are not like terms. This has an x on it, and that does not. Okay, on the right-hand side of the equation, y minus y is going to cancel, and you could either write that as 5 plus 2x or 2x plus 5. Again, those are not like terms, so we can't combine those either. Now, even from this point, you may be saying, how am I supposed to get y all by itself? Well, if you want to get the y all by itself, if you have a y in this term and a y in that term, the only way to get the y out of those two terms is to factor it out. So if you factor out a y, in parentheses, you'd be left with x minus 1. Right, when we factor out a y, I'm taking this y and bringing it out, so I still have the x, and then I'll bring down my minus sign. When I take the y out of here, y divided by y is 1, so that's why we write the x minus 1. And then you can bring down your 2x plus 5. Okay, to finish getting the y by itself, let's just divide both sides by x minus 1. And now when these cancel, we finally have the y by itself. So I'm going to rewrite that instead of y equals as f inverse of x equals, and it leaves us with 2x plus 5 over x minus 1. Okay, that fraction does not simplify, so there's our answer. So that is letter A. All right, number 6 is very similar to number 5, so you probably should hit pause and try this on your own. All right, so here we go. We are rewriting f of x as y equals. That way we know to switch our y to an x and both of our x's to y's. Okay, so just like in the last one, since this is a fraction, let's take our x and make it into a fraction by putting it over 1, and that way we can cross multiply. So when we cross multiply, when we multiply the top left by the bottom right, you would take this x and distribute it to both terms. So this would give us xy and then minus 7x. So we'll write xy minus 7x and then bring down the equal sign. Then when you multiply the top right by the bottom left, 3y minus 1 times 1 is just 3y minus 1. All right, so let's take all of our y terms and move them to one side of the equation. So I'm going to subtract 3y from both sides. And then I'm going to take my other terms and move them to the right. So if we have a negative 7x, let's add 7x to both sides. So on the left, the negative 7x and positive 7x cancel. So I could bring down my xy minus 3y. And we cannot combine them because they are not like terms. This has an x in front of the y. This has a number in front of the y. And then on the right-hand side, 3y minus 3y cancels. So I'm left with 7x minus 1, which if you wrote as negative 1 plus 7x, that's okay as well. So now, in order to get the y out of these two terms, we're going to have to factor it out. So when we factor it out, it would leave me with x minus 3 in parentheses. So we basically just took the y out of both of these two terms. So we were left with the x minus 3. And then I'll bring down my equals, 7x minus 1. And to finish getting the y by itself, let's divide by that x minus 3. So that leaves us with, instead of y equals, I'm now going to write f inverse of x equals 7x minus 1 over x minus 3. All right, and that finally brings us to number 7, although we can't see it on here because the hole punch kind of chopped off our number. All right, let's do the same thing. Oh, this time actually they're giving us the inverse, and they want us to figure out which equation would be f of x. Now, let me tell you, you do not have to go through and find the inverse for each of these to see which one gives you this. Basically, if they give you the inverse, if you find the inverse of an inverse, it'll give you your function. So for example, like if I had, let's say I had the point 2, 5, and I wanted you to find the inverse of that. We would just switch the x and y. We would write that as 5, 2. Now let's say I started you off with this point, 5, 2. Let's say I started you off with the inverse, and I wanted you to find the original point. Wouldn't that just switch the x and y again to bring us back to where we started? So if they give you an inverse, just find the inverse of that inverse, and that'll give you the original equation. All right, so let's, this is really like saying y equals, oh, let me not use yellow, that's pretty bad. So y equals, so we're going to switch our y to an x, and we're going to switch the x to a y. Okay, and this one should be fairly straightforward. We're just going to solve for y. So let's subtract 2 from both sides. So that gives us x minus 2 equals negative 3/4 y. And rather than dividing both sides by negative 3/4, I would just multiply by the reciprocal of this fraction. So the reciprocal of negative 3/4 would be negative 4/3. And don't forget the negative sign, because remember, a negative times a negative is a positive. We want to be left with a positive y on this side. All right, so then I'm also going to multiply this side by negative 4/3. Okay, so when I distribute negative 4/3 times x is negative 4/3 x. Negative 4/3 times negative 2, I'm going to make that negative 2 over 1. So a negative times a negative is a positive. And then if we multiply our numerators, 4 times 2 is 8. And if we multiply our denominators, 3 times 1 is 3. And on the left-hand side of the equation, these 3's cancel, these 4's cancel, and as we said before, a negative times a negative is positive, so we're left with positive y, which we could now rewrite as f of x. Not f inverse of x, because remember, they gave us f inverse of x. All right, so what does this one match up with? This matches up with letter B, it looks like. So this would be our answer.